In the autumn of 1878, in the dry foothills east of Flagstaff, Arizona territory, a young woman named Cora Vane arrived at the edge of a charred field with a mule, a length of chain, and a purpose no one who saw her that morning could fathom. She was 27 years old. Her father had died the previous spring, leaving her his wheelwright's tools, a rented stall behind the livery, and a name people in the territory associated with fine work and early graves. There was no husband, no brother, no claim to his shop. The owner of the stall had already let it to another man by the time Cora returned from burying her father in the Prescott Cemetery. She had his tools, a canvas bag of savings she counted to $31.40, and the knowledge he had pressed into her hands across 20 years of apprenticeship, though no one in Flagstaff thought to call it that. Her father, Edmund Vane, had come to Arizona territory from Ohio in 1858 with a trade at his fingertips and no illusions about the frontier. He had established his wheelwright shop on the south end of Lareau Street, where he repaired and built wagon wheels and running gear for the freighting companies that moved goods through the territory, and he had run that shop without a break for 20 years, through drought and boom and the slow thinning of the timber trade, through the arrival of the railroad, which changed everything about how freight moved, and nothing about the need for wheels and axles, and the men and women skilled enough to maintain them. He had taught Cora from the time she could hold a spokeshave, not as a novelty and not out of sentiment, but because she was the child present in the shop, and because the work needed doing, and because she had a steadier eye than he had at her age. By the time she was 14, she could true a wheel on the hub without his guidance, and by 18 she was doing finish work he trusted enough to send out under his name. He never said this aloud to her. He did not think acknowledgement necessary when the evidence was in the work itself. She understood this because she had learned to read the same way she had learned to read a wheel, by attending to what was there rather than waiting for someone to describe it. When he died of the lung illness he had carried since the previous winter, the shop passed back to its landlord by the terms of the lease agreement, and the three men who had worked alongside Cora in the final months departed for other employment, taking with them whatever implicit credibility her presence had carried by association. She was what she had always been, Edmund Vane's daughter, which in Flagstaff in 1878 meant something different than it had meant when he was alive to stand beside it. The field at the edge of Barrow Road had been a transport yard once, run by a freight company called Eames & Sons. The company had failed in 1874, and the yard had passed through several short-lived hands before the last of them, a speculator from Santa Fe who had bought it for the parcel of flat land behind it, allowed the buildings to fall and the equipment to rot. There had been a fire in August of that year, origin unclear, that swept the dry grass and reduced most of what remained to ash and iron. The speculator had walked the ruins once, decided nothing worth retrieving had survived, and departed. He had not looked closely at the far corner of the lot, beyond the line where the fire had burned hottest. Cora had. She had come to the yard 3 days after the fire. During the week, she spent walking every available property in the area, trying to identify something she could acquire with what remained of her money and work into a livelihood. The smell of char was still heavy on the October wind. She had pulled her shawl over her nose and walked the burned ground in her practical boots, stepping over collapsed timber and pools of rust water, until she reached the far corner where the ash lay thinner, and a shape emerged from it that stopped her in the middle of a step. It was the 7th property she had walked that week. The others had told her something useful in their failure. A collapsed livery on Beaver Street, the roof gone and the walls leaning, which she had assessed and dismissed because the structural timber was rotted through before the fire found it, and there was nothing sound to work from. A lot behind the mill district with a partial fence and a rusted chainfall hoist that a previous tenant had left, worth perhaps $4 in iron scrap and nothing more. A narrow parcel on Cherry Street with a shed on it, which she had rented tentatively and then let go when the owner revealed the terms of the underlying ground lease made any improvement revert to him at 2 years, rather than the 5 he had stated at first. She was not despairing in those walks, though someone who saw her from across the street might have read her silence as grief. She was evaluating. The week had a purpose, and she was carrying it out systematically, the way her father had taught her to approach a job she could not yet visualize. Start at the edges. Identify what is not there, and the center of the thing will declare itself. A wagon. Not a simple farm conveyance, but a large covered freight wagon, the kind her father had called a Murphy after the Illinois builder who made them famous on the western routes. The fire had taken the canvas cover and charred the sideboards and scorched the wheel spokes black, but the iron tires were intact on all 4 wheels. The iron bolts that joined the bed timbers showed no catastrophic damage, and the wagon tongue lay in the ash still attached, still straight. The undercarriage, shielded by the wagon bed itself as the canvas above burned away, was largely unburned. A Murphy of that size, she knew, could carry 3,000 pounds. The running gear alone, stripped and refurbished, was worth $60 to the right buyer. She stood in that corner of the ruined yard for a long time, turning over what she saw, the way her father had taught her to study a wheel before touching it, to read the thing before presuming to correct it. She noted the hand-carved axle blocks, the turned hubs, the fitted iron collars at each wheel center that told her this was not a production piece but custom work, built by someone who knew what they were doing. If you have ever stood before a ruined thing and seen in it not the ruin, but what persists beneath it, you will understand something of what Cora Vane understood in that field. She went to find the speculator. His name was Aldous Frick, and she located him through the land office in Flagstaff, where he had registered the parcel. He was temporarily residing at the Territory Hotel on LaRue Street, and she went there directly. He received her in the lobby, a compact man in a pressed suit, his expression the particular kind of polite that costs nothing and means nothing. She told him she was interested in purchasing the burned wagon in the far corner of the Barrow Road yard. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said she was welcome to it for $3, provided she removed it herself, as he had no intention of returning to the property. She paid him the $3 before he could reconsider, and obtained his signature on a bill of sale she had prepared on a sheet of paper that morning at the hotel writing desk, using a borrowed pen and ink. The men at the livery where she rented the mule the following day were not subtle in their amusement. Word had preceded her, as word did in Flagstaff. A woman who had paid $3 for a burned-up freight wagon in a ruined yard, intending to drag it home behind a mule. One of the hostlers, a young man named Pete, said she might as well have bought herself a pile of charcoal and saved the trouble of the chain. The other men laughed, and Pete grinned at his own cleverness, and Cora accepted the mule's lead rope and said nothing. She drove the mule out to Barrow Road in the early morning, the chain in the wagon bed she had borrowed from the smithy, the October air cold enough to see her breath. The field looked worse in the fresh light than it had in her memory, a blasted flat of gray ash and blackened timber, the smell of old fire coming up with the dew. She walked to the far corner and stood before the wagon. Her father's voice came to her, not as a ghost, not as anything mystical, only as the remembered weight of his instruction. He had told her once, watching her strip a wheel that looked ruined beyond use, that fire was honest. It destroyed what was weak and left what was not. The iron in a good wheel, he said, did not care what the wood around it had suffered. She chained the front axle and set the mule to work. Getting the wagon onto the road took the better part of 3 hours. The burned wheels did not roll cleanly. The left rear had seized on its hub, and she spent 40 minutes working a pry bar she had brought for exactly this possibility, loosening the collar, packing the dried bearing socket with grease from her kit until the wheel moved again. The mule was patient and large and required only steady management. By mid-morning, she had the wagon on Barrow Road and was walking it toward Flagstaff at the mule's pace, her shawl pulled tight against the wind off the mountains. People saw her. It was unavoidable. A woman in a red shawl walking a burned freight wagon through the streets of Flagstaff behind a rented mule was not an invisible sight. She heard the comments from the boardwalks, most of them brief, some of them loud enough to be intended. She kept her attention on the mule and the road surface, watching for ruts that might pull the wagon sideways. She had negotiated the use of a corner of the lumber yard on Agassiz Street, belonging to a man named Hobson, who had known her father and owed him a small, uncollected courtesy. Hobson offered her the corner without charge for 60 days, and she thanked him plainly and set the wagon in it, and did not ask him what he thought of the project. The work began that same afternoon. She began at the wheels because her father had taught her that a wagon is only as sound as its running gear, and the running gear is only as sound as its wheels. She pulled the left rear wheel and examined the hub on the ground. The fire had dried the wood and cracked the felloes, the curved segments of the wheel rim in 2 places, but the mortise and tenon joints where the spokes entered the hub had held, and the hub itself, white oak, dense and old-growth tight-grained, showed no structural failure. She measured the crack in each felloe with a caliper she had inherited from her father, and found neither had penetrated more than 1/4 of the depth of the wood. Repairable. The iron tire, after she cooled and cleaned it, was not warped. She could reset it. The cleaning alone took a full day. She had brought a wire brush and a scraper and a bucket of water from the lumber yard's trough, and she worked the char off each wheel surface methodically, starting with the iron tires and working inward to the wooden structure beneath, because you cannot assess fire damage through a layer of soot and ash. What the cleaning revealed was, in several places, better than she had expected, and in one place, worse. The right front spoke set had been oriented toward the fire's source, and the outer face of 6 spokes showed burn damage deeper than she had calculated from the initial assessment. She would need to replace them. The wood for this she could source from Hobson's own stock, white oak in the rough, which she would need to turn herself on the spoke horse she had brought from her father's shop. She worked through the first week that way, wheel by wheel, pulling each, examining each, cataloging what required replacement and what required only cleaning and resetting. By the end of 5 days, she had all 4 wheels off and standing against the lumber yard fence, each one assessed and ranked by the order in which she would address it. Her notes, in pencil on a sheet of brown paper, read like a physician's chart, each wheel given a column, each component listed with a mark indicating its condition: sound, repairable, replace. The replace column was shorter than the repairable column by a ratio she found encouraging. Hobson brought her a cup of coffee on the 3rd day and watched her work for a while without speaking. At length, he said she was doing her father's work. She said she was doing her own. He nodded at that, accepting the correction, and left her to it. On the 6th day, she began the spoke replacement. The spoke horse, a simple wooden vise her father had made to hold wheel spokes during shaping, was the piece of his equipment she had valued most when dividing what she could carry from what she must leave behind. She clamped the first rough-cut blank into it and drew the draw knife down the length of the wood, feeling the grain and following it, the blade angled correctly to remove material with the grain rather than against it, which would cause a split no amount of care could correct. Her father had made her practice this until she could do it without looking at the angle, reading the grain by feel and sound, the way a person learns to read handwriting. by the patterns that recur beneath the variations. She shaped 12 spokes in 2 days and pressed them into the front right hub with the spoke set, driving each home with the mallet until the shoulder seated cleanly, then examining each joint before proceeding to the next. When all 12 were seated, she put the wheel on a flat section of the lumber yard floor and trued it, sighting down the face from 3 feet away and tapping the high spots with the mallet head until the wheel stood without wobble. The first time wasn't quite right, and she trued it again, and the second time it was correct. The wagon bed had fared worse than the wheels. The sideboards were charred through on their outer faces, and 2 of the bed planks had burned enough to crack under pressure. She pulled them and set them aside. The underlying frame, the heavy oak sills and cross members that formed the bed structure, was sound. Her father had told her that builders like the Murphy wagon's original craftsmen used white oak for the primary structure because it held its integrity under stress that would split pine or elm. The fire had proven him right. She ran her hand along the main sill on both sides and found no softness, no give, no hidden failure. It was during the second week, pulling the front axle to re-grease the kingpin, that she found the box. She had the axle clear of the wagon and was examining the space beneath the bed frame when she noticed that the front cross member, the wide plank that spanned the undercarriage just behind, where the tongue attached, was not a single piece of wood, but 2 pieces. Edge-fitted so carefully that the joint line was nearly invisible in the fire-darkened wood. She would not have seen it at all in better light. In the low afternoon sun, with the shadow of the wagon bed above her and a crack of light coming in from the side, the joint threw a thin line of shadow that the rest of the timber did not. She lay flat on the ground and looked at it. The front cross member was hollow. Her father had described this construction to her once, years before, in the context of a repair he had made on a stage line's coach. Teamsters and freighters who moved valuables on frontier routes sometimes commissioned hidden compartments in the structural timbers of their wagons, spaces built into load-bearing members where the cavity would not be apparent to a casual search. The technique required a builder of real skill, because a carelessly hollowed timber would fail under load. A well-made one would not. This was a well-made one. She spent an hour working the joint with a thin pry and her smallest wood chisel before she understood the mechanism. The front face of the cross member was a fitted lid, held not by a latch, but by a wooden pin set into a channel, rotating like a tumbler in a lock. She had seen this principle before in her father's shop, applied to a different kind of lid, and she sat back on her heels in the cold afternoon and recognized what she was looking at. You do not forget a thing your father taught you in the specific warmth of an afternoon in his shop. The smell of shavings and linseed oil, and the sound of his voice explaining a small and elegant mechanism. She had been 16 years old, and he had shown her the rotating pin channel on a storage lid he was repairing, and he had said that whoever built the original had understood that the strength of a hidden thing is not in the lock, but in making the seam invisible. She found the pin channel by touch, not sight, running her finger along the lower edge of the cross member until she felt the slight depression where the channel opened. She pressed and turned. Something gave. The front face of the cross member swung inward on its fitted edge, and in the cavity behind it, in the cold darkness of a space that had been sealed for she did not yet know how many years, lay a tin dispatch box the size of a large ledger book, its surface dull and unburned, the air around it carrying the particular cold smell of an enclosed space long shut. She did not open it there, under the wagon, on the ground. She set it in the shadow of the lumber stack and covered it with her shawl, and finished the day's work. Because her father had also told her that a woman who abandons her work to chase what she has found is a woman who loses both. That restraint cost her something. She was aware of the box in the shadow of the lumber stack in the way a person is aware of a sound they cannot identify. A low, persistent note at the edge of attention. She finished setting the kingpin and ran the axle back under the bed frame, checking the drag of the connecting pin, and she did not allow herself to go back to the box until the wagon was secure on its jack stands for the night, and she had wiped down her tools and hung them on the board she kept them on. It was dark by the time she took the box inside the small room she had rented on Birch Street and set it on the table under the lamp. The box was secured with a brass hasp and a small padlock. The padlock was a Ward type, a design she recognized from her father's collection of salvaged hardware, and she had a set of picks for Ward locks in her kit because her father had kept them and taught her their use in the same spirit. He taught her everything, because competence is larger than any one trade, and a person who understands how things open is a person who is never entirely without resource. It took her 11 minutes. She had counted. Inside the dispatch box, beneath a piece of oilcloth folded against moisture, lay 3 items. The first was a bundle of folded papers tied with a cloth ribbon. The second was a small leather notebook with brass fittings. The third was a cloth bag, heavy for its size, that clinked when she lifted it. She set the bag aside and opened the papers first. They were contracts. 4 of them, dated across a span from 1869 to 1872, bearing the name of the Eames and Sons Freight Company in their headings and the signatures of the company's principals at their foot. They concerned land. Specifically, they concerned a series of parcels in the territory south of Flagstaff, along the road to Williams, that the Eames Company had contracted to transport building materials to on behalf of a man named Reyes Delgado, a rancher and dry goods merchant who had been building outbuildings and a water cistern system on land he had held since the late 1860s. The contracts were for the transport work, but what made them notable was the attached schedule of payments. Each contract showed Delgado paying the Eames Company not merely for freight, but for something listed in the margin of the payment schedule as surveying consultation. She read the phrase 3 times. The lamp was steady. The room was quiet. The word consultation was the one her eye kept finding, its presence in a freight contract as anomalous as a lock on an interior structural timber, something placed where it was not expected, meaning something it did not openly state. She did not understand this at first. She set the contracts aside and opened the leather notebook. The notebook was a working journal, the handwriting small and careful, the entries dated. It had belonged to a man whose name appeared on the inside cover in a firm, slanted hand. Thomas Eames, the eldest son of the Eames and Sons partnership. The entries ran from 1869 through the spring of 1873, and then stopped. What they recorded was a scheme in which the Eames Company's contracted hauling work for Delgado had been used to conduct unauthorized surveys of Delgado's land, the results of which Thomas Eames and his father had then transmitted to a territorial land speculator named Garfield Morrow, who used the information to file competing land claims against Delgado's parcels before Delgado could file the formal title papers he had been accumulating funds to pay for. The mechanism was cold and precise. Delgado had trusted the Eames wagons on his land. The surveyors traveled as freighters. The claims were filed using data Delgado never knew had been collected. By 1874, 3 of the 4 parcels he had improved and used for 14 years were under competing claim, and his resources were gone to legal resistance that went nowhere because the competing filings cited survey data he could not challenge because he did not know the data existed. The Eames Company had failed that same year. Thomas Eames's journal recorded this without apparent regret, noting only that the surveying consultation fees had been paid in full by Morrow before the company dissolved. The wagon had been abandoned in the Barrow Road yard. Nobody had come back for it. She sat at the table for a long time, reading the journal entries twice, and then reading the contracts again. The cloth bag contained coins, gold and silver, an amount she counted carefully by lamplight and found to be $83.40. Thomas Eames's last journal entry noted that this sum represented the final payment he had not deposited, held in the dispatch box against what he called an eventuality that had not arrived before the company closed. She wrapped everything in the oilcloth and returned it to the dispatch box and went to sleep, because she thought better after sleep than before it. In the morning, she went to find Reyes Delgado. It took her 2 days. He was not in Flagstaff. She found his name in the land office records, and the clerk, a young man who did not object to her questions, told her that Delgado had reduced his operation significantly after the land dispute and now ran a small goods store on the road to Williams at a settlement called Cottonwood Crossing. She thanked him and hired a horse for the 2-day ride. The road south and west ran through dry country, the ponderosa pine thinning to pinon and juniper, and then opening into wider grassland as the elevation dropped. She rode with the dispatch box in her saddlebag and the October wind at her back, and she used the time on the road the way she had learned to use the time between work and sleep, turning the problem from different angles, testing her reading of the contracts and the journal against the objections a careful person might raise. The objections were real. Thomas Eames was dead. She had confirmed this through a brief inquiry before leaving Flagstaff. He had died in 1876 in Tucson. His father was in a care institution in California. Garfield Morrow was alive and still held the land claims, or at least had held them as recently as the previous year, which was the most recent information the land office could provide her without an extended search she had not asked for. A dead man's journal was not the same as testimony. She knew this. What it was, held alongside the signed contracts with their anomalous notation, was a body of documentary evidence that pointed in one direction and could not easily point elsewhere. She arrived at Cottonwood Crossing at midday on the second day, the horse tired and her back stiff from the saddle. Cottonwood Crossing was a small place, 4 buildings and a water trough and a scattering of homesteads beyond the road. The goods store was the largest of the buildings, an adobe structure with a brush ramada at the side. Reyes Delgado was 61 years old, a compact man with white in his hair and a careful, assessing manner that reminded her of her father in some deep structural way. The manner of a person who had learned that the world offers nothing freely and that scrutiny is not suspicion, but prudence. He looked at her in the doorway for a moment before he stood aside to let her in. He did not ask what she wanted, which she read as the habit of a man who had learned that waiting costs less than premature assumption. She sat with him at the back of the store, behind the counter, and she put the dispatch box on the table between them and opened it. She showed him the contracts first and watched his face as he read. He was still for a long time. Then he read the journal. When he was finished, he set the notebook down with a very deliberate gesture, as though placing something heavy. He said, "Where did you find this?" She told him. She described the wagon, the cross member, the rotating pin mechanism. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment, and then he said that his grandfather had built the storage technique she described into a piece of furniture, a sideboard, and that his grandfather had told him it was a maker's trick from the old country, a way of keeping the valuable thing where no one would look for it, because they would not know to look. She did not comment on the coincidence of it, that the mechanism by which the thing had been hidden was also the mechanism by which she had been able to find it. Some convergences earned their own silence. She told him that the contracts and the journal, in her reading of them, constituted sufficient documentation to support a formal land claim challenge. She was not a lawyer, she said plainly, and she was not rendering legal opinion, but she knew what a contract said, and she knew what a journal entry said, and she knew that the surveying consultation fees were listed by name and date and amount in a document signed by the Eames principals. She told him that Garfield Morrow, the speculator, was still in the territory. She had checked. Delgado asked her what she intended to do with the box and its contents. She said it was his. The contracts named him. The wrong had been done to him. The box belonged in his hands, not hers. He looked at her for a long moment. He asked why she had ridden 2 days to give it to him rather than selling the information to a lawyer who might pay well for it. She said her father had taught her that a tool belongs in the hand that was meant to use it, and that giving a thing to its right owner was not charity, but completion. She left the dispatch box with Delgado and rode back to Flagstaff. The legal process that followed was not swift, but it was thorough. Garfield Morrow, confronted with the journal entries and the signed contracts, did not attempt to deny the scheme in its particulars. His counsel filed papers and counterpapers and delayed the proceedings for the better part of 14 months, as was the counsel's right and function. At the end of those 14 months, the territorial court ruled that 2 of the 3 parcels under competing claim had been registered using fraudulently obtained survey data, and that Morrow's claims on those parcels were void. The 3rd parcel was ruled on separately, and it went to a protracted arbitration that Cora did not follow in detail, having by that time considerable work of her own to attend to. She had finished the burned wagon by March. She had replaced the 2 cracked bed planks with seasoned oak boards she sourced from a mill in Williams, making the trip herself with a rented freight horse and bringing back enough material to do the bed work and have boards left over for future use. She had reset all 4 iron tires, the same iron, cleaned and cooled and driven straight onto the freshened felloes without a piece of it being replaced, because the iron had been sound, as her father said it would be. The tire setting was work that required a fire and a ring mold and good timing, because the tire had to expand in the heat and contract on cooling to grip the wheel rim, and she had done it enough times under her father's supervision to have the sequence in her hands without counting. She had turned new spokes for the front left wheel, where the fire had done its worst work, pressing them from the same white oak as the original. She pressed the new boards into the bed frame and fitted them with wooden pegs at their ends, the same method the original builder had used, and she sealed the joints with a mixture of pine tar and linseed oil that she brushed into the grain and left to cure for 3 days before she would allow weight on the bed. The wagon bed, refitted and sealed against weather, was straight and solid. The running gear, re-greased and aligned, moved as it had been built to move. She rolled the wagon out of Hobson's Corner on a cold, clear morning in March and brought it to the lumber yard road, where she had room to pull it in a straight line and watch the wheel track. The wheels ran true and the tongue sat level, and the iron tires caught the light as they turned. Hobson watched from his doorway and didn't say anything. She ran an advertisement in the Flagstaff paper and sold the wagon to a freighting contractor from Winslow for $85. He inspected it for the better part of an hour, going over the wheel assemblies and the bed frame and the undercarriage. And at the end of the inspection, he offered her $80, and she said $85. And he accepted because the wagon was worth what she said it was worth. Hobson, who had watched the whole project from the door of his lumber yard, said afterward that he had not believed it could be done. He said this without embarrassment, acknowledging the extent of his underestimation as a simple fact rather than an apology. Cora accepted the acknowledgement in the same spirit. and said only that the wagon had been honest about what it still had. Have you ever held a thing everyone else said was finished and known, in the way you know a soundboard from a cracked one by the sound it makes under your hand? That they were wrong. That feeling does not need a name. It simply is. She used the $85 and the $31.40 she had held since her father's death to lease a proper workshop on LaRue Street, 3 doors from the hotel where she had found Aldous Frick. She hired a boy named Clement to help with the heavy work, a strong and quiet young man who'd been doing odd labor at the lumber yard and who learned what she showed him without requiring it to be shown twice. She began taking in repairs, wagon, and coach work, primarily, and within 4 months she had a waiting list. The workshop was larger than her father's stall, and she spent the first 2 weeks arranging it the way she needed it, rather than the way its previous tenant had left it. She hung her tools on a board behind the main bench, each in its place by type and size, so that she could find anything she needed without looking, the same organization her father had kept. She put the spoke horse near the window for the light, and the tire-setting ring outside under the lean-to at the back, and she set up a small forge in the corner for the ironwork, having bartered the right to use the smithy's equipment against 3 repair jobs she did for his customers at no charge, and then decided she needed her own. Clement learned to run the forge at the temperature she required, and she showed him how to dress a wheel hub with the packing tool so that the bearing ran without drag, and he proved capable at this once he understood what the drag felt like under his hand, as opposed to in his head. He was 17 years old and did not have the craft, but he had the attention, and attention was the part she could not teach from nothing. Her father had told her that the craft can be given to someone who does not yet have it, but the attention must already be there to receive it. Reyes Delgado sent her a letter in the spring of 1879, after the court ruling on the 2 parcels. He wrote in careful English that the ruling had allowed him to resume use of the land, and that he had planted a field of hay on the larger parcel, enough to carry his small herd through the next winter without purchasing feed. He thanked her for bringing the box to him. He did not use effusive language. The letter was plain and measured, and she read it twice and kept it in the drawer of her father's plane, the smoothing plane he had given her the year before. He grew ill, the one she used for fitting the fine joints in wheel hub work. Pete, the hostler who had made the joke about the charcoal, came to her shop in June with a spoke that had sheared on a customer's delivery wagon. She charged him the ordinary rate for the repair and did the work while he waited, and when he paid her and collected the wheel, she thanked him without irony. He had the grace to look somewhat abashed, which cost him nothing and was sufficient. The smoothing plane hung on a nail at the back of her workshop, behind the bench where she did the precision-fitting work. Her father had made the body himself from a piece of quarter-sawn beech he had carried from Ohio when he first came west, and the finish on it had worn to a particular warm darkness from 30 years of his hand, and then from the years of her own. It was not a display piece. She used it every working day. The iron blade kept an edge longer than any other tool she owned, and she sharpened it on the waterstone every other evening, and found the sharpening as satisfying as the work itself, the small restorative act of bringing a worn thing back to what it was meant to do. The wagon she had dragged through the streets of Flagstaff in the October cold, the thing Pete had called a pile of charcoal and the men at the livery had laughed about, was hauling freight between Winslow and Holbrook by the following spring, carrying loads its buyer said it handled without complaint. He wrote her a brief note saying so, because she had asked him to send word of how it performed, and she read the note and was satisfied. She did not think of it often. There was always other work. If patience is a skill, it is one that must be practiced on actual things, not in the abstract. The wagon had been her examination, and she had passed it. and the work itself had been its own answer to every joke made on the boardwalk and every comment called from the street. She had not needed to reply then, and she did not need to reply now. The dispatch box sat on the shelf above her workbench, empty and clean, its lid open. She had kept it for no reason she could have articulated clearly, except that it was good hardware, well made, and that she had a habit her father had given her of keeping the well-made things that came into her hands rather than discarding them, because a well-made thing is never as finished as it appears. Late in the autumn of 1879, on a morning when the frost had come in and the mountains north of Flagstaff were showing their first snow, she set aside the wheel hub she was fitting and went to the bench and took the smoothing plane down from its nail and ran it once along a scrap of pine board, feeling the ribbon of shaving curl up and the surface below come smooth and true. And she set the plane down on the bench and looked at what it had made, the small, bright path of worked wood in the midst of all the ash-colored roughness around it. That was enough. That was always enough.